So today we're going to talk about the 3 best cardio methods that you can use, destroy some myths about them, and figure out how to best implement them into your training schedule. So let's get straight into it. Now, whenever we talk about cardio, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is to go outside or to hop on a treadmill and do a run. Now, although this kind of cardio is usually said to not be football specific because you're not going to be running at a set speed for a set amount of time, it is not necessarily out of place when it comes to building your cardio. So now running at a set speed for a set amount of time is known as LSD or long slow distance cardio. Now, although it has slow in its name, it's not all that useless because in a while you realize that it's not actually as slow as you think it is. So typically any run beyond 30 minutes is considered as LSD, and a run only qualifies as LSD if you're running at least 70 to 75% of your VO2 max. And VO2 max is essentially the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can take in when you're doing a certain activity. And most of the time, you're not improving your cardio by doing LSD because you're not actually running at 70%. And most of you don't even know what running at 70% looks like. So if 1 is a walk and 10 is a full-out sprint, 7 out of 10 is where you would want to give your effort for an LSD. And most of the time, even if you try to give a 7 out of 10, you will realize that your efforts are actually more like a 6 or a 6.5. And if you want to know how to actually calculate 70% of your VO2 max without using any fancy equipment, then stick around until the end of the video because I'll show you exactly how to do it with some basic math. So what LSD does is that it promotes aerobic capacity, whereby it allows you to be able to run for long periods of time without feeling tired. So if you're especially someone who gasses out before 90 minutes, then LSD might be the way to go for you and to improve your cardio. So think of a marathoner who can run 2 hours plus in a race. They are the ones who have large aerobic capacities because they are the ones who are training LSD the most. Now, most people will tell you that this is not football specific and that you would not be able to play football properly and your cardio will not improve if you do this type of cardio. I'd argue that this is not completely true because LSD acts as the foundation for all the other high intensity cardio that we'll be talking about later. So imagine going to the gym and you want to lift heavy weights fast. You first have to learn how to master those weights slowly. And LSD teaches you how to master your cardio slowly before moving on into faster and more intense cardio. And remember that LSD builds aerobic capacity. So if you don't have the capacity to do the work in the first place, how are you going to build power and how are you going to be able to do things at a higher intensity if you can't even do them at a lower intensity first? Now, I mentioned that LSD usually requires you to run for at least 30 minutes. But when it comes to football, I'd say you can cap it around 30 or 45 minutes because you're not going to be needing to run at the same pace for a very long time. So you just need to build that foundation, and once you have the capacity to do the work, then you can move on to more intense versions of cardio. So since we've talked about the cardio on the lowest end of the spectrum, now let's talk about the one on the highest end of the spectrum. So the one on the highest end of the spectrum is known as HIIT, or some of you may know it as HIIT, and it's known as high intensity interval training. So essentially what this is that you're working beyond maximal intensity, which is beyond your 100% VO2 max for very short durations of time. And if you're wondering how are you able to actually work beyond 100%, then it's because if you realize VO2 max is oxygen intake. So if you're working beyond your VO2 max, you're not actually using oxygen anymore. So whenever you're using oxygen, you're actually in an aerobic state. And when you're not using oxygen, you're in an anaerobic state. So doing HIIT actually promotes anaerobic capacity because it helps you work without oxygen for longer durations of time. And although I say longer, it doesn't actually extend to a minute or two. It just means that a few extra seconds longer. And the reason this is so important is because in football, there's so much of change of direction and bursting of speed that you need to be able to recover from that as quickly as possible. And being able to expand your anaerobic capacity as much as possible is important for you to recover as soon and as quickly as possible. So since you're working at such high intensities, most of the time you would be sprinting, and therefore you would be able to improve your fast twitch muscle fibers, which then will enhance your sprinting ability as well. Now, if you're someone who runs out of breath after a few sprints, HIIT is probably one of the best exercises that you can do for yourself. If you're lacking speed endurance and you cannot recover quickly from a sprint, then this is the type of cardio that you would want to work on. And HIIT usually involves a 1:5 work-rest ratio. And essentially what this is that if you work for 2 seconds, you're going to rest for 10 seconds. So it's 1:5. So you can imagine how tiring it actually is to do this, because you're going to need so much of rest afterwards to be able to recover and then go again at a very, very high intensity. So imagine covering 200 meters in 30 seconds and then resting for 2 minutes and 30 before going again. So whenever exercise involves an anaerobic state, we always find that there's always a buildup of lactate in the muscles. And if you're someone who does not train the anaerobic state, your body will not be able to tolerate the amount of lactate that you build up in your muscles, and therefore your performance is going to drop. So make sure that you implement this into your training session as well, because it is very important that you're able to not only sprint quickly, but also be able to sprint, recover, and then sprint again. So now that we've talked about both ends of the spectrum, let's go slightly into the middle and talk about interval training. Now, although interval training sounds a lot like HIIT, which is high intensity interval training, interval training is actually a little less intense. So since HIIT involves you working beyond 100% and working in an anaerobic state, interval training still involves you working in an aerobic state, which means you would be using oxygen, but instead of building aerobic capacity like we did with LSD, this time we are building aerobic power. So interval training involves working beyond 80% of your VO2 max, and generally it is a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So if you work for 1 minute, you rest for 1 minute. So what aerobic power essentially is that it allows you to work for longer periods of time with higher intensity. So think of being able to work at 80% of intensity or higher for maybe a minute or longer, and then being able to recover from that very quickly. So in football, sometimes you're not all out sprinting, but you are going at a very high speed, maybe close to your sprinting speed, and then you would have to recover from that as well. And this is when aerobic power actually comes into play. Now, although interval training sounds very similar to HIIT training, interval training actually improves your body's rate to produce energy through the aerobic system. So to put simply, the better your aerobic power is, the more energy your body is able to generate when you're performing a certain activity. So we talked a lot about VO2 max in this video, and I did promise you that I'll show you how to calculate it. So the most accurate way to calculate VO2 max is essentially with those masks that you see pro footballers wearing, and that whenever they're on the treadmill or they're on a bike, they're breathing into that mask, and then it is calculating the VO2 max for them. Now, without all of those fancy equipment, you can still calculate your VO2 max with simple maths calculation. Before we do your VO2 max calculation, there are a few terms that you need to know first. Now, the first term is RHR. RHR is essentially your resting heart rate. Your resting heart rate is essentially your pulse calculation when your body is in a resting state. So the best time to calculate this is when you've just woken up in the morning. And the way to calculate this is to use your index finger and your middle finger, and you can either put your fingers at your carotid artery, or you can put it at your radial artery on your wrist, and you can calculate your number of pulse in a minute, and then you can write that down as your RHR. Now, the next term that you want to know is MHR, and MHR is basically your maximum heart rate. Now, to calculate your maximum heart rate, you're going to take the number 220, which is a constant, and you're going to minus it with your age. So say you're 20 years old, 220 minus 20 is 200. Now, 200 is not an absolute number of your maximum heart rate, rather think of it as a range. So if 200 is the number that you get, you want to plus 5 and minus 5. So your maximum heart rate will be between 195 and 205. Now, the third term that you would want to know is HRR. And HRR is basically your heart rate reserve. And this is the amount of oxygen that you have in your reserve that you can work with. So to calculate your HRR, you take your maximum heart rate minus your resting heart rate, and whatever number you get, that is your HRR. So if you're someone who has been working out for quite some time, I recommend that you go with the higher range of your MHR. But if you're someone who's just starting out, then maybe start off with a lower range. So say you want to calculate 80% of your VO2 max. So you're going to take 80%, multiply that with your heart rate reserve, and then you're going to add it with your resting heart rate. So to put this all into calculation, say you're 20 years old. So your maximum heart rate would be 220 minus 20, which is 200. So a range of that will be 195 to 205. Now let's assume that your resting heart rate is 50. So if I go with the higher end of my maximum heart rate, which is 205, 205 minus 50 would be 155. So now 155 is the range that I can work with. So if now I wanted to calculate 80% of my VO2 max, I take 0.8, multiply it by 155, and then I'll add 50 to that. And the number that I get is now 80% of my VO2 max. And whenever I go out and I do my cardio, I want to ensure that my pulse is actually at this number so that I know that I'm hitting 80% of my VO2 max and that my cardio is actually as efficient as I want it to be. Now, a way to implement all of these cardio sessions into your training session is that if you're just starting out, I'd recommend that you use LSD and you aim for at least 30 minutes at 70% of your maximum heart rate. And the reason for this is because when you're just starting out, you do want to build that capacity first so that when you go out and do these more intense versions of cardio, you'd actually be able to sustain for as long as you want to sustain. Now, remember to always ease into the workouts if you're just starting out and aim to do 1 to 2 sessions per week and then slowly ease into it. And once you have gotten used to it, then you can probably add another session into the week. Now, if you're someone who's more advanced or you don't have trouble sticking until 90 minutes of the game, then I recommend you skip LSD and you focus more on HIIT or interval training. So for this, you can do it 1 to 3 times a week. And I would recommend you to mix HIIT training and interval training to get the most benefits out of it. You could maybe do 1 HIIT session and 2 interval trainings, or you could do 2 HIIT sessions and 1 interval training. And each of your training sessions should also last for at least 30 minutes so that you are able to reap the most benefits out of it. Now that you have a blueprint on how to improve your cardio, you would also want to know how to accelerate other aspects of your game. So make sure to check out this video right here to find out the best and fastest way to improve your entire football game. But thank you so much for watching. Make sure you hit the subscribe button down below and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!